The sun was just beginning its slow climb into the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and pink. The air carried a crispness that hinted at autumn's arrival, and the quiet country road seemed almost untouched by time. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their melodies blending with the gentle rustle of leaves stirred by a cool breeze. It was the kind of morning that made you want to pause and take it all in, a moment of peace before the day's work began. Henry. Johnson knelt beside his old sedan, his knees resting on a worn-out piece of cardboard to keep the damp ground from soaking through his overalls. The car had seen better days. Its once shiny paint job had faded to a dull gray, and patches of rust clung stubbornly to its body like scars earned over decades of faithful service. But Henry didn't care about appearances. To him, this car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a companion, a relic of memories both happy and hard. And right now it needed his help. A flat tire had stranded him there, but Henry wasn't one to panic or complain. He'd spent most of his life fixing things, cars, appliances, even broken fences, and he knew how to handle problems with patience and skill. His hands moved steadily as he loosened the lug nuts, each turn of the wrench accompanied by the faint creak of metal against metal. Sweat trickled down his brow, catching the sunlight as it slid along the deep grooves etched into his skin by years of labor. Despite his age, his movements were deliberate and strong, a testament to decades of experience. As he worked, Henry hummed an old spiritual tune under his breath. The melody was soft but steady, weaving itself into the fabric of the peaceful morning. It was a song he remembered from childhood, sung in the small church his family attended every Sunday. Back then, life had been simpler, or so it seemed now. He thought about those days often, especially when moments like this reminded him of who he used to be. A young man full of dreams, working tirelessly to provide for his loved ones. But today, the road felt lonelier than usual. There weren't many cars passing by, and the ones that did rarely slowed down. Most drivers cast only fleeting glances at the elderly black man kneeling beside his weathered car before speeding off again. Henry didn't mind. He was used to being overlooked, to existing in the background while others rushed past without a second thought. Life had taught him not to expect much more. Just as he was tightening the last lug nut, the distant rumble of an engine caught his attention. A shiny pickup truck appeared around the bend, its polished chrome gleaming in the morning light. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and Henry glanced up briefly, expecting it to continue on its way. Instead, it came to a stop a few feet ahead of him. Two young men sat inside, their faces partially obscured by the glare on the windshield. For a moment, they simply stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Henry returned to his task, focusing on securing the spare tire. He didn't feel the need to engage with strangers, especially when he was busy, but something about their presence lingered uneasily in the back of his mind. They didn't drive off immediately as he'd hoped. Instead, the engine idled loudly, filling the otherwise serene morning with an unwelcome noise. After what felt like an eternity, the truck sped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust that swirled around Henry like a ghostly reminder of their intrusion. He shook his head slightly, brushing away the annoyance that threatened to creep in. People came and went, he reminded himself. Their opinions didn't matter, not really. What mattered was finishing the job and getting back on the road. Still, as he packed away his tools and wiped his hands on a rag, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about those two men had unsettled him. Maybe it was the way they'd looked at him, their eyes lingering a little too long, their silence heavy with unspoken judgment. Or maybe it was the nagging sense that they weren't done with him yet. Little did Henry know, his instincts were right. Those two men would return, and when they did, they would bring with them a storm of words and actions that would test his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. But for now, the morning remained calm, the world holding its breath as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Henry climbed back into his car, turned the key in the ignition, and drove off, unaware of the challenges and surprises that lay ahead. The quiet rhythm of Henry's drive was interrupted sooner than he expected. Just as he rounded a bend in the road, the shiny pickup truck reappeared, this time screeching to a halt directly in front of him. The suddenness of it startled Henry, and he instinctively pressed the brake pedal, bringing his old sedan to a shaky stop mere feet from the rear bumper of the truck. For a moment, there was silence, save for the hum of the idling engines and the distant chirping of birds. Then the two young men stepped out. They were dressed casually but deliberately, their clothes clean and expensive-looking compared to Henry's faded overalls. One wore a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, while the other had messy blonde hair that caught the sunlight. Both carried an air of arrogance, their postures relaxed yet domineering. The taller of the two held a beer bottle loosely in one hand, its amber liquid sloshing slightly as he gestured toward Henry with exaggerated nonchalance. "What do we have here?" the taller man drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. He tilted his head to the side, appraising Henry as though he were some strange curiosity on display. His companion leaned against the hood of the truck, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. They exchanged glances, sharing a private joke that excluded everyone else, especially Henry. Henry sat still behind the wheel, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to observe them. Years of life experience had taught him when to speak and when to remain silent. There was something about their energy that felt dangerous, not necessarily physical, but sharp-edged all the same. It was the kind of danger that came from thoughtlessness, from people who hadn't yet learned to consider the weight of their words or actions. "Look at this guy," the shorter man chimed in, his tone shifting from amused to openly hostile. "What are you doing out here? Lost your way back to the junkyard?" He laughed loudly at his own joke, slapping his knee for emphasis. The sound echoed unnaturally in the open space, breaking the tranquility of the morning like shattering glass. Henry's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd heard insults like these before, countless times in fact, and he knew better than to let them rattle him. Still, each word landed with a dull thud, chipping away at the armor of patience he'd built over decades. These moments always brought back memories he preferred to leave buried. Faces twisted in disdain, voices raised in anger, doors slammed shut because of the color of his skin. But Henry wasn't a man to dwell on bitterness. He focused instead on staying calm, reminding himself that reacting wouldn't change anything. The taller man took a step closer, narrowing the gap between them. "Seriously, dude," he said, leaning down to peer through the driver's window. "This car looks like it should be in a museum, or maybe a landfill. What's wrong? Couldn't afford something newer?" His words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Henry finally turned his head to meet the man's gaze. Up close, he could see the faint sheen of sweat on the young man's face, the slight twitch of his lips as he waited for a reaction. Henry studied him for a moment longer than necessary, his dark eyes steady and unflinching. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm, carrying an authority that surprised even him. "This car gets me where I need to go," he said simply. "That's all that matters." For a split second, the taller man looked taken aback as if he hadn't expected an answer at all, but then his smirk returned, wider this time, fueled by the thrill of pushing boundaries. "Oh, come on, old-timer," he sneered. "Don't tell me you actually like driving around in this piece of garbage. You must be embarrassed." His friend chimed in again, laughing too loudly and clapping his hands together. "Yeah, seriously, this thing probably guzzles gas like crazy. Bet you can't even afford to fill it up half the time." The insults kept coming, faster now, overlapping each other in a chaotic jumble of cruelty. They mocked everything: the Iago car, Henry's appearance, his age, his race. Each word was designed to cut deeper, to strip away dignity, and replace it with shame. And yet, Henry remained silent. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles whitening slightly, but he didn't rise to their bait. Instead, he stared straight ahead, focusing on the horizon beyond the windshield. It wasn't easy. Every insult stirred old wounds, reopening scars he thought had healed long ago. He remembered standing outside grocery stores as children pointed and laughed at his patched-up shoes. He remembered being denied service at restaurants because of the color of his skin. He remembered countless instances where people assumed he was less capable, less intelligent, less worthy simply because of how he looked. Those memories lingered in the corners of his mind, shadowy figures waiting to be summoned by careless words. But Henry also remembered something else: resilience. He thought about the times he'd stood tall despite the jeers, the times he'd walked away knowing he was better than the hatred directed at him. He thought about his late wife, Evelyn, who used to say, "Their words can only hurt you if you let them." Her voice echoed softly in his ears, a comforting reminder of strength found in grace. As the tirade continued, a small crowd began to gather. A few cars had slowed down to watch the spectacle unfold, their drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering under their breath about the rudeness of the two young men. Others simply watched silently, unsure of whether to intervene or move along. No one stepped forward to help. Henry noticed the growing audience, but refused to acknowledge it. He didn't want to give the impression that he needed rescuing. He never had before, and he wasn't about to start now. Besides, he knew that sometimes stepping in only made things worse. He'd seen enough confrontations spiral out of control to know that calmness was often the best defense. The taller man seemed to grow bolder as the seconds ticked by, emboldened by the lack of resistance. He leaned farther into the car, his face inches from Henry's. "You got nothing to say, huh?" he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too stupid to come up with a comeback." His friend doubled over with laughter, clutching his stomach as though the comment was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. But Henry didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension flow out of his body. Then, without warning, he reached for the gear shift and turned the ignition key. The engine sputtered to life, coughing once before settling into a steady purr. "You boys enjoy your day?" he said quietly, his voice steady and devoid of malice. With that, he eased the car into gear and drove past the truck, leaving the two men standing in the middle of the road momentarily stunned into silence. As Henry disappeared around the next bend, the taller man turned to his friend, confusion written across his face. "Did he just ignore us?" he asked, his tone incredulous. His friend shrugged, still chuckling nervously. "Guess so. Weird old guy." Neither of them noticed the pair of headlights approaching in the distance, or the determined woman behind the wheel who had witnessed the entire exchange. The sleek black SUV pulled over just a few yards ahead of where the two young men still stood, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and defiance. The driver's door opened with a soft click, and out stepped Margaret Langley, her presence commanding yet composed. She was in her late 40s with sharp features that spoke of both authority and kindness. Her tailored blazer and pressed slacks gave her an air of professionalism, while her warm brown eyes hinted at a deeper empathy beneath the surface. Margaret approached the scene with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the asphalt. Her gaze swept over the situation quickly, Henry's retreating car disappearing down the road, the shiny pickup truck idling nearby, and the two young men standing awkwardly by its side. Without hesitation, she addressed them directly. "What's going on here?" Margaret demanded, her voice firm but not harsh. It carried a tone that brooked no nonsense, the kind of voice people listened to whether they wanted to or not. The taller man, beer bottle still dangling from his fingers, glanced at his friend nervously before attempting a casual shrug. "Nothing much," he said, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. "Just messing around." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Messing around? That didn't look like harmless fun to me." She gestured toward the direction Henry had driven off in. "Who was that man you were yelling at?" The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his shoes as if suddenly fascinated by them. Some old guy fixing his car. We were just joking around. No big deal." "No big deal?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising slightly. She took a step closer, her height and demeanor making the two men instinctively take a half step back. "Do you think calling someone names and mocking their belongings is just joking around? Do you even realize how disrespectful that is?" Her words hit like a hammer, forcing the young men to squirm under her scrutiny. They exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of what to say next. The taller man finally stammered, "We didn't mean anything by it. Honest." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. Intent doesn't erase impact, she said pointedly. What you did matters whether you meant to hurt him or not. You can't treat people that way and expect there to be no consequences. The weight of her statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For the first time since the encounter began, the two young men seemed to grasp the seriousness of their actions. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of guilt. One of them muttered something under his breath, too quiet for Margaret to hear, but the other remained silent, staring at the ground. Satisfied that she'd made her point, Margaret turned her attention away from the offenders and scanned the road again. Spotting Henry's sedan still within view, she called out, "Wait!" Her voice carried far enough for Henry to hear, prompting him to slow down and eventually stop. He rolled down his window, peering out cautiously. "Sir?" Margaret said, approaching his car with a respectful nod. "Are you okay? Did those two bother you?" Henry hesitated for a moment, his weathered face betraying little emotion. Then with a slight smile he replied, "I've been through worse, but thank you for asking." Margaret studied him for a moment, noting the calmness in his demeanor despite the obvious tension of the situation. There was a quiet strength about him, a resilience that spoke volumes without needing to be articulated. She extended her hand toward him. "My name is Margaret Langley. I'm an attorney, and I couldn't help but notice what happened back there. Are you sure you're all right?" Henry shook her hand gently, his grip firm despite his age. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am, but I'm fine. Just another day, you know." Margaret frowned slightly, sensing the layers of meaning behind his words. "It shouldn't be just another day," she insisted. "No one deserves to be treated like that. If you'd like, I can report this incident. Those two need to understand the gravity of their behavior." Henry chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Ma'am, I've seen plenty of folks like them come and go. Reporting them won't change who they are. Sometimes it's better to let things slide." Margaret sighed, recognizing the wisdom in his response, but unwilling to let the matter drop entirely. "Maybe so," she conceded. "But ignoring injustice doesn't make it disappear. Let me at least offer you a ride home. Your car looks like it could use a break after all that." Henry hesitated, glancing at his sedan affectionately. "She's tougher than she looks," he said with a small smile. "But I won't lie. She's earned her rest today. All right, I'll accept your offer. Thank you kindly." With that, Henry parked his car safely on the shoulder and climbed into Margaret's SUV. As they drove away, leaving the two young men standing silently by their truck, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled upon something significant. This wasn't just about a flat tire or a couple of rude remarks. It was about dignity, respect, and the enduring human spirit. "So," Margaret began after a few moments of comfortable silence, "how long have you lived in this area?" Henry adjusted his seatbelt and settled in, his posture relaxed despite the whirlwind of emotions he'd experienced earlier. "Oh, most of my life," he replied. "Born and raised here, though I left for a spell when I was younger. Came back when my wife fell ill. Never left again after that." "I'm sorry to hear about your wife," Margaret said sincerely. "That must have been hard." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It was. Evelyn was the light of my life. Losing her, well, it changes a person. But she taught me a lot about patience and forgiveness. Things I try to hold on to, even when times get tough." Margaret listened intently, captivated by the depth of Henry's character. Here was a man who had endured hardships many couldn't imagine, yet he carried himself with grace and humility. She found herself wanting to know more, not just about his struggles, but about the triumphs that had shaped him into the person he was today. As they continued driving, Margaret noticed the modest homes and sprawling fields passing by outside the window. "This town has changed quite a bit over the years," she remarked. "Do you think it's for the better?" Henry chuckled, a low rumble that sounded almost musical. "Change is always complicated," he said thoughtfully. "Some things improve, others don't. Folks around here are friendly enough, but there's still plenty of ignorance to go around." Guess that's true everywhere, though. Margaret nodded in agreement. Unfortunately, yes. But stories like yours remind me why it's important to keep fighting for progress. People like you inspire hope. Henry waved her off modestly. I'm just an old man fixing cars and minding my own business. Nothing special about that. You're selling yourself short, Margaret countered with a smile. Not everyone handles adversity the way you do, with such poise and understanding. Trust me, that's rare. They arrived at Henry's house shortly afterward, a cozy little place, surrounded by tall oak trees whose leaves shimmered golden in the autumn sunlight. Margaret parked in the driveway and turned to face him. Thank you for letting me drive you home, she said warmly. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything. Here's my card. Henry accepted the card with a grateful nod. You've already done more than enough, ma'am, but I'll keep it in mind. Before stepping out of the car, he paused and looked at her earnestly. You're doing good work, Ms. Langley. Keep it up. The world needs more people like you. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, touched by his sincerity. And it needs more people like you, Mr. Johnson. Don't underestimate the power of leading by example. With that, Henry exited the vehicle, waving goodbye as Margaret drove off. As he watched her SUV disappear down the road, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps this encounter had been more than just another challenge to endure. It might have been the start of something greater, a ripple effect of kindness and courage that could spread farther than he ever imagined. Margaret's SUV had barely disappeared around the bend when Henry turned to head inside his modest home. The house was small but welcoming, its wooden porch adorned with potted plants that Evelyn had once lovingly tended to. As he stepped through the creaky screen door, the familiar scent of aged wood and faded furniture enveloped him, a comforting reminder of the life he'd built here over the years. He placed Margaret's card on the kitchen counter, next to an old coffee mug stained with years of use. It wasn't the first time someone had offered help or expressed admiration for how he handled adversity, but there was something about Margaret's persistence that lingered in his mind. She seemed genuinely invested, not just in making sure he was okay, but in addressing the larger issue of how people treated one another. Her words echoed softly in his thoughts. The world needs more people like you. Henry shook his head slightly, dismissing the compliment as he always did. He didn't see himself as extraordinary. He simply believed in doing what was right, even if it meant swallowing pride or enduring pain. Still, he couldn't deny that today's encounter had stirred something within him, a mixture of frustration, sadness, and, strangely enough, hope. He brewed a pot of coffee. The sound of footsteps outside caught his attention. At first, he assumed it was one of his neighbors stopping by to borrow a tool or share some fresh produce from their garden. But when he opened the door, he found the two young men standing awkwardly on his porch, their faces pale and uncertain. The taller one held his baseball cap in his hands, twisting it nervously, while the shorter one shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact altogether. Mr. Johnson, the taller man began, his voice trembling slightly. We came to apologize. Henry blinked, taken aback. Of all the possibilities he'd considered, this hadn't been one of them. He studied their faces carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the discomfort. After a moment, he nodded slowly and stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. You might as well sit down, he said evenly. Coffee's almost ready. The two men hesitated before stepping inside, their eyes darting around the cozy living room. The space was simple yet warm, filled with photographs of Henry and Evelyn, handmade quilts draped over the furniture, and shelves lined with books and trinkets collected over decades. It was clear that this was a home lived in and loved. Henry returned to the kitchen, pouring 3 mugs of coffee and adding a splash of cream to each. He carried them back to the living room, handing one to each of the young men before settling into his worn armchair. For a few moments, no one spoke. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Finally, the taller man cleared his throat. Look, Mr. Johnson, "We're really sorry about earlier. We didn't mean to be so rude. It was stupid and we feel awful about it." His companion nodded vigorously in agreement. "Yeah, we weren't thinking. We thought we were just messing around, but now we realize it wasn't funny at all. You didn't deserve that." Henry sipped his coffee slowly, giving himself time to process their words. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but deliberate. "Apologies are good," he said, "but they don't change what happened. What I want to know is why you felt the need to say those things in the first place." The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. The two men exchanged uneasy glances, neither eager to answer. Finally, the shorter one spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess we were trying to act tough, like show off for each other, you know? We didn't think about how it would make you feel." "And why did you pick me?" Henry pressed gently. "Was it because of my car, my age, or was it something else?" This time the taller man answered, his face reddening with shame. "It was everything, I guess. Your car, your clothes, the way you looked. And yeah, your skin color too. We didn't even realize we were being racist until later. It's just stuff we've heard growing up, you know? Things people say without thinking." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying them thoughtfully. Their honesty, though painful to hear, was refreshing. Many people in their position would have tried to deflect blame or minimize their actions, but these two were owning up to their mistakes, at least for now. That took courage, however small. "You know," Henry began after a pause, "when I was your age, I faced a lot worse than name-calling. Back then, folks wouldn't serve me in restaurants or let me try on clothes in stores. I've been pulled over by police for no reason other than the color of my skin. I've had doors slammed in my face and been told I didn't belong somewhere. Those experiences stay with you. They shape who you are." The two men listened intently, their expressions a mix of shock and guilt. Neither had ever considered the weight of systemic racism, or how their casual cruelty fit into a much larger pattern of discrimination. They'd always thought of themselves as good guys, the kind of people who wouldn't hurt anyone intentionally. Yet here they were, sitting across from a man whose life had been shaped by the very attitudes they'd perpetuated. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Henry continued. "I'm telling you because understanding where others come from is the first step toward change. You can't fix what you don't acknowledge." The taller man swallowed hard, visibly moved. "So, what do we do now? How do we make it right?" Henry smiled faintly, appreciating their willingness to learn. "Start by listening," he advised. "Listen to people who are different from you, people whose lives haven't been as easy as yours. Ask questions even if they're uncomfortable. And most importantly, treat everyone with respect no matter who they are or what they look like. Respect costs nothing, but it means everything." The shorter man nodded earnestly. "We'll try, Mr. Johnson, I promise." "I believe you will," Henry replied. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. If you truly want to make amends, prove it through how you live your lives moving forward." The conversation stretched on for nearly an hour, with Henry sharing stories from his past and offering advice born of hard-earned wisdom. By the time the young men left, tears glistened in their eyes, and their apologies felt genuine rather than rehearsed. They promised to volunteer at a local youth center, focused on promoting tolerance and understanding. A pledge Henry encouraged wholeheartedly. As he watched them drive away, Henry felt a flicker of optimism. Perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps acts of kindness and courage could create ripples far beyond what anyone anticipated. Today, two young men had taken the first step toward becoming better versions of themselves. Tomorrow they might inspire others to do the same. Henry returned to his kitchen, setting the empty coffee mugs in the sink. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The day had been long and emotionally taxing, but it had also reminded him of something important. Even in moments of darkness, there was always room for light. The weeks that followed Henry's unexpected encounter with the two young men passed quietly, yet they carried a sense of change, a subtle shift in the rhythm of his life. The autumn days grew shorter, and the air turned crisper, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys. Henry returned to his routine, tending to small repairs around the house, walking through the fields behind his property, and occasionally visiting the local library to borrow books on history and philosophy. He wasn't one to dwell on past events, but he found himself reflecting more often than usual on the apology he'd received and the promise those two men had made. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread throughout the small town. Margaret Langley played no small part in this. She mentioned the story during a community meeting at the local church, framing it not as gossip but as an opportunity for reflection. She spoke passionately about the importance of accountability, empathy, and growth, using Henry's grace under pressure as an example of how individuals could rise above adversity. Her words resonated deeply with many attendees, sparking conversations that rippled outward like waves across a pond. It wasn't long before others began sharing similar stories, moments when kindness or understanding had transformed a difficult situation. A retired teacher recounted how a former student, once unruly and disrespectful, had later apologized and gone on to become a mentor for at-risk youth. A young mother described forgiving a neighbor who had initially been hostile toward her family after moving into the predominantly white neighborhood. These anecdotes created a collective atmosphere of introspection, encouraging people to examine their own biases and actions. For Henry, however, life continued much as it always had. He didn't seek recognition or praise for what had happened that day on the roadside. To him, it was simply another chapter in a long book of experiences, some challenging, some rewarding, all valuable in their own way. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing attention his story was receiving. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, offering warm greetings and heartfelt thanks for inspiring them to think differently. Some even invited him to speak at community gatherings, though he politely declined, insisting he was just an old man fixing cars. Margaret, however, wasn't willing to let Henry's influence go unnoticed. One afternoon, she arrived at his doorstep unannounced, holding a stack of papers and wearing a determined smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said as Henry opened the door, "but I need your help." Henry chuckled softly, stepping aside to let her in. "Help with what?" "You're the lawyer here, Ms. Langley. I doubt I can offer much advice." Margaret waved off his modesty as she settled onto the couch, spreading out her documents on the coffee table. "This isn't about legal matters. It's about something bigger. I've been working on an initiative aimed at combating racism and promoting tolerance in our community, and your story has inspired me to expand it statewide, but I can't do it without your support." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I want you to share your experience publicly," Margaret explained. "Not just locally, but on a larger platform. Imagine the impact your words could have if more people heard them, not just in this town, but across the state. Your resilience, your ability to forgive. It's powerful. People need to hear that." Henry leaned back in his chair, considering her proposal. On one hand, he understood the value of storytelling as a tool for change. Stories had the power to connect people, to bridge gaps between different perspectives and foster understanding. On the other hand, he'd always preferred to lead by quiet example rather than standing in the spotlight. Public speaking wasn't his forte, and the idea of sharing such personal memories made him uneasy. "I appreciate the thought, Ms. Langley," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. There are plenty of folks better suited to talking about these issues." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No one is better suited than someone who's lived through it, Henry. Your voice carries authenticity that no politician or activist can replicate. Besides, you don't have to give speeches or write essays if you don't want to. We can start small, maybe a video interview or a written statement, whatever feels comfortable for you." Her persistence was hard to resist, especially when she framed it as a chance to make a difference. Henry knew firsthand how impactful acts of courage and compassion could be, and he couldn't deny the potential good that might come from sharing his story. After a long pause, he sighed and nodded. "All right," he said. "If you think it'll help, I'll do what I can." Margaret beamed, clearly thrilled by his agreement. Over the next hour, they discussed the details of the initiative, brainstorming ways to amplify its reach while staying true to its core message of respect and understanding. By the time she left, Henry felt a mix of apprehension and excitement, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who usually preferred predictability. A few days later, Margaret returned with a videographer in tow. They set up a simple recording area in Henry's living room, positioning a camera on a tripod and arranging soft lighting to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. Henry sat in his usual armchair, dressed in clean overalls and a button-up shirt, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Despite his initial nerves, he found comfort in the familiarity of his surroundings, the photographs of Evelyn smiling. Down from the walls, the quilt draped over the back of the couch, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Just talk like you normally would," Margaret encouraged as the camera rolled. "Pretend we're having a conversation, not filming a documentary." With that reassurance, Henry began to speak. At first, his words were hesitant, carefully chosen as if testing the waters. But as he delved deeper into his memories, the struggles of his youth, the love and partnership he shared with Evelyn, the lessons he'd learned along the way, his voice grew stronger, more confident. He spoke openly about the challenges he'd faced as a black man in a world that often sought to diminish his worth. But he also emphasized the beauty of resilience and the transformative power of forgiveness. By the time the interview ended, both Margaret and the videographer were visibly moved. "That was incredible, Henry," Margaret said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You have a gift for making people see things differently." Henry shrugged modestly, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I just told the truth," he replied. "If it helps even one person think twice before acting out of ignorance, then it was worth it." The video was uploaded to social media platforms and shared widely, accompanied by Margaret's impassioned commentary about the need for systemic change. Within days, it went viral, garnering thousands of views, comments, and shares. Viewers praised Henry's wisdom and humility, calling him a beacon of hope in divisive times. Schools reached out requesting permission to use the video as part of their diversity and inclusion curricula. Local news outlets featured segments on Henry's story, highlighting the broader implications of his message. To Henry's surprise, the response wasn't limited to virtual interactions. Strangers began stopping by his house, leaving notes of gratitude tucked into his mailbox or dropping off homemade pies and casseroles as tokens of appreciation. One elderly woman drove over an hour to thank him personally, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. "Your words reminded me of my father," she said. "He faced so much hardship too, but he never lost his faith in humanity. You've given me hope again." Despite the overwhelming attention, Henry remained grounded. He continued his daily routines, refusing to let fame or whatever semblance of it he'd gained distract him from what truly mattered. Yet he couldn't deny the profound effect the initiative was having. Margaret reported that donations were pouring in to fund educational programs, workshops, and community building projects aimed at fostering dialogue and dismantling prejudice. The ripple effect of Henry's courage was undeniable. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Henry reflected on everything that had transpired. He thought about the two young men who had insulted him, now volunteering regularly at the youth center. He thought about Margaret's tireless dedication to creating a better future. And he thought about the countless individuals whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by his decision to forgive and engage. In that moment, Henry realized something important. Change wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it started with a single act of grace, a willingness to listen, or a story shared with honesty and heart. And sometimes it took root in the most unexpected places, like a quiet country road where an old man fixed his car and chose kindness over anger. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Henry smiled to himself. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he felt hopeful for his community, for the world, and for the generations to come.